Thank you for watching the Housing Oregon YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe. Slide decks from the presenters are going to be available below. Thanks for watching.
Hello, everybody. Eugenia and I were just talking about how lovely it is that we'd have such a nice turnout in the last conference presentation of the conference. So cheers to all of you. Thank you. It's hard to get a conference time for the last meeting time of a conference and feel encouraged. So thank you for the encouragement. We're excited to present to you guys today the topic of the value of post-occupancy survey and affordable housing. My name is Hayley Purdy.
And my name is Eugenia Famá-Higgins.
We are both colleagues at Scott Edwards Architecture. Scott Edwards Architecture has been around for over 26 years with a huge focus in community-driven projects. Our first client was Virginia Garcia, providing a community-based healthcare solutions, and we continue to work with them. Community is one of our main drivers, and very important also as well to a lot of the work that Eugenia and I are part of. Eugenia and I, as well as many of us at Scott Edwards, have played an active role in bringing over 1,400 units of affordable housing to the market, and we are here to talk about a lot of the lessons learned through that community-driven process. Eugenia is going to introduce as well Bienestar, who is a client of Scott Edwards and was important in this presentation.
Yes, as Hayley mentioned, we collaborated with Bienestar. For this presentation, we worked together in the Nueva Esperanza project. We were able to have a very successful post-occupancy survey, so we were able to incorporate a lot of the feedback, data, and information, and the whole process that we did in this project. Bienestar is a nonprofit. Their mission is to build housing, hope, and community for the well-being of Latinx immigrants and families in need. So we are very thankful for their participation in this presentation today.
So like I said before, come on in. Like I said before, my name is Hayley Purdy. I'm a principal at Scott Edwards Architecture. We've been very lucky to have worked on multiple affordable housing projects here in the Portland and greater region, actually. Eugenia and I are working together on an affordable housing development currently in Vancouver, which is lovely. I'll let Eugenia introduce herself as well.
I'm Eugenia with a difficult name here, so I go many versions. I'm from Argentina originally. I studied architecture at the University of Buenos Aires, had my license there, and then moved to Oregon in 2010. And since then, I have most of my experience in multifamily, especially affordable housing and community-based projects. So I'm very excited to be here in this conference with you all.
That was much better said than me, so thank you. So today, we formulated a thesis statement as we put all of this data together, and it really helped us to inform how we were going to format and share the data with you. What we kind of came to understand was that first, we know that Holst, a lovely architecture firm also doing a lot of affordable housing here in the metro area, gave a presentation last year about post-occupancy surveys. And so in an effort to be a little bit more considerate of what we felt like needed to also be addressed in addition to their presentation, we noticed that we still wanted to talk about how post-occupancy surveys and what we learned from them can be agents for change. And so that's sort of what we'd like to talk about and focus about a little bit more holistically today, in addition to our post-occupancy survey process at Scott Edwards Architecture. We want to focus on the fact that there is a bigger question and a bigger idea here that is something that we want to address, and that a post-occupancy survey as part of the process can help to facilitate that and facilitate change. And so one of the things that's what we'd like to explore in the presentation today is really how the survey process can facilitate that change with you all. So what does that process actually look like as architects, as well as with owners, developers, resident services, property managers? We've really see that the process and where post-occupancy surveys fall is actually smack dab in the middle. And that for the process to be an equitable design process and for the process to really be a considered process, that it needs to involve these three different phases. The first phase is engage and design. The second phase is survey and analyze. And the third phase is really responding to that data-driven information and making change with the data. So we're going to talk through each one of these processes, spending most of the time on the survey and the analyze, but really talking about what it means to have data-driven change.
So to start with this first phase of engagement and design, we want to emphasize of how important it is to go in details into this phase in order to have a successful post-occupancy survey. SEA's approach is to have a robust work upfront during this process. So we are going to be sharing a little bit of the community engagement, the due diligences, the design development, and how we understand and go over the owner requirements and goals. So we don't want to talk a lot about community engagement, but yes, about a few important things in regards of when and how we do community engagement. Ideally, the when is like early in the design. So during a schematic design and early in the design development is when we want to gather as much information as possible and do the community engagement in order to be successful and have the time to implement this in the design. In the Nueva Esperanza project with Bienestar, we were very lucky because the client was very committed to do community engagement for the diverse population that they wanted to serve. So we were able, even though it was a pandemic, we were able to have very successful community engagement. And this tells a little bit about how we do community engagement. And this is something that always will evolve and change and need to be adapted to the community that we want to engage. Could be in person, could be virtual, could be after office hours, weekends. We need to adapt ourselves in order to facilitate conversation and gather the feedback that we need.
We also know, as many of the architects probably in this room do know, that part of the process on the outset of this phase is the due diligence process. The due diligence process shouldn't be taken lightly. It is an important part of the equitable design process and frankly can significantly inform a lot of the decisions that we make on the outset of the design. So those components are acknowledgement of the site, the zoning, acknowledgement and reaching out to the associations, providers, the different services that go into the actual development. It's recognizing, processing, and integrating the data and the demographics of where we're doing the development and acknowledging those in the actual design process. And it's taking time to understand the neighborhood's history. So some of the examples we show here were with our client Saban CDC and making sure that we acknowledged all those components through that due diligence phase.
So what you see in the screen is a very colorful site plan of Nueva Esperanza, and I don't expect you to go over or read the small text, but I think what this shows is like how a successful community engagement can be translated in a successful design where we were able to implement a lot of the feedback into the design of the project. And just to mention a few examples, we were able to design dually units according to their feedback. some feedback in regards of the common areas or amenities were coming from these engagement meetings. For the outdoors areas, the same, like specific things start to the community we were saving, like having piñata poles or a green area for soccer, different outdoor spaces and different scales, breaking up the scales so people were able to connect with each other. So for us, at that time of the design, a successful design was like responding to their questions with real actions in the design and not only leaving to the end for them to pick up maybe some colors. So we took this very seriously, and that for us was the success of the community engagement.
One of the other really important parts of this first phase of engaging in design is soliciting owners' project requirements. I mean, it sounds very simple, right? But often missed. And so at Scott Edwards, we have this document which we start at the beginning of a project with a client. And what it tries to really capture is, like we just said before, a lot of that due diligence with demographics. It also looks to the client to tell us some of the ownership plans that will really influence the design and the development. We're looking for client goals. We're looking for information about green strategies for green buildings and ratings. We're looking to understand the client's appetite, interest, and sort of approach to community engagement, as well as things like precedents. Sometimes we're very lucky to work with a client that we've worked with before, but in a lot of cases, that's not so much the case. And then we really do need to spend a lot of time understanding what those precedents were for the client, for the owner, for the operator, and making sure that they are discussed at the outset of a project through a document like this, so that we can, as through the design process, keep going back to a document like this and referring to it, so that as designers, and owners, we aren't missing the mark.
So now here we are at the second phase. I know we set up this presentation to talk about surveys, and we wanted to highlight the importance of the previous phase. And now we are going to share a little bit more of the details of our process when we start a survey, the format of the survey, the type of questions that we usually do without over all of them, for sure, and how we process the data and the lessons learned or what we do next. So this is a visual of how the post-occupancy survey is looking, usually 2 pages. There are a few questions at the beginning that are kind of specific about the name of the person that is participating, where they live, how long they've been living in the building. The ethnicity is optional, but it's also going to be very important when we share some of the data in the next slides, and also we'll tie some of the things and interesting information to the community engagement that we did. So having this question for us was relevant to understand some of the responses that we received. You can see in the format that most of the questions have like boxes, so they can check how satisfied they are with a specific question, but also very important to leave a space for them to add comments, especially when there are areas of improvements. We want to understand what's going on, what can we do better. So having this space for them to share their thoughts is very important as well. The format, we always try to provide digital options, but always printed copies as well, and depends on the projects and the community that is going to be filling these surveys. Having this in multiple languages can be very valuable. For example, in Nueva Esperanza, we were able to do this in Spanish and in English. Yeah. So these are some of the ACA best practices or takeaway things that after doing a couple of surveys in some successful projects, we were able to understand that, for example, using some generic questions, but some specific questions are relevant. And just to give an example, sometimes if we ask only, are you satisfied with the design of the dual unit? And they say yes or no is not enough. We want to also understand if they are happy with the design of the kitchen or with the cooling system. So adding more specific questions are going to provide more information for us to analyze. Also, keeping not more than 25 questions is ideal. Like if we have a few, we don't get enough information. If we have way so many, people won't finish this. So that's kind of like a sweet spot. Having the most important questions at the beginning of the survey, as always, important as well. As we mentioned in the previous slide, having a space for them to share their thoughts and comments. That was very valuable and surprising for some of the questions that we have. Provide the survey in multiple language, we went over that. And balancing the type of questions, that ties a little bit to the variety of questions. As I mentioned, we don't only want to ask questions tied to the design, but also about how they feel in the space, about safety or the mechanical systems, like the performance of the building. And also, in our experience, giving a gift card or a type of incentive for their time and commitment of them for doing this survey was very successful as well. Next one.
So one of the things that Housing Oregon asked us as we prepared for this presentation was to take a step back and make sure that we acknowledged owners' feedback as to how the post-occupancy survey went. And so that was part of the reason we introduced Vienna Star. So while we have conducted a handful of post-occupancy surveys recently, we're going to focus on some of the feedback we received from Vienna Star about the post-occupancy survey process. So some of those takeaways that we received were that it was best to often let the residents know ahead of time that the survey was coming. Sounds pretty simple, but it is good to do that. That interestingly enough, the time of year in which you issue the survey is actually very important and should be considered in an effort to get not only a lot of representation and response, but also to get a certain level of response. In other words, a post-occupancy survey issued within a month of within the month of residents living there isn't very valuable. So therefore, trying to get that survey conducted about a year out is actually much more informative. That we should expect and acknowledge that most of the feedback we will receive are complaints, and that's okay. It's okay to get only complaints. It's really lovely to get positive affirmation, but it's okay to know that most of them will be complaints. That we also heard from the owner that the format and the delivery of the survey was very successful, and we can see that based upon the response rate that we got from residents. The number of residents which responded was wonderful. They also asked that we note that that residents should be asking property management or resident services for input. And last but not least, that resident services were better suited to be implementing a survey than property management. So not something I would have taken away from the survey process, but good to know from the owner.
So we want to go over a few of the questions that are telling us a little bit the type of questions that we want to ask and the benefits of them. So for example, we ask how satisfied are you with the kitchen layout of the apartment? So in this question, when we ask about the kitchen design, the community engagement, we were receiving a lot of feedback on how they want to leave the space, and we designed toward that. So being able to see that the majority of the residents were satisfied was also a sign that potentially the community engagement was successful. But also, when we received some responses that need some improvement, it was very interesting to read their comments of why. Maybe they wanted to have more storage, or they wanted to have another sink. So being able to have the space in the survey for them to add the comment is relevant. If not, we will just have like a percentage of people that are being satisfied or not, and not able to address what we can improve in the next round or in the next project. Another important question was in regards privacy, safety. This has many reasons for being successful or not. There might be constraints in the site. There are maybe many reasons of why this can be successful or not. but tells a little bit about what the residents expect and want to feel in their homes. We asked a few questions that we knew the response, it will be maybe not that positive. For example, how satisfied are you with the noise levels in your apartment? We hear project after project that acoustic is always an issue, and that's ended up being sometimes an issue for the client because sometimes they can't just afford what is required per code. So being able to understand how people feel about it might be able to inform priorities. Maybe in the next project, the acoustic need to be a priority versus something else. So asking these important questions about the performance of the building, I think will inform the community that you are serving and what they need. How satisfied are you with the parking? We got many responses. This is when people start like writing and expressing. So we got a bunch of different responses that it was hard to summarize. But this is the one that we sometimes have less control. Could be tied to the site constraints, could be tied to what the clients can provide. But it was very eye-opening that sometimes depend on the locations of the project, what is required per code is not meeting really the needs of the families that are living in these apartments. Or some decisions for the clients, if they decide to assign parking versus not, are people liking this approach or not? So I think it's worth it to ask this question, even though we know that maybe the potential response is not a positive one. So we wanted to make a connection in between the community engagement efforts at the beginning and how people are really experiencing living in these apartments, because that was a big question. Everybody put a lot of effort, and we want to understand how valuable it is, how many things we were able to accomplish, do we have some lessons learned from them? So one of the interesting things that we learned is like when the project is complete and goes out for leasing, there is not a way really to control who is going to be living in this apartment, if it's the same community that you were doing the engagement. So this put a lot of responsibility sometimes in the clients that is doing an engagement with a specific community to then be able that we are going to be advertising and they are going to be doing a lot of marketing and reaching out to the communities that they want to serve. So they are ready to sign up when the leasing is open, because if not, maybe you ended up having a population that is not the one that you designed for. Besides that, we have a conversation with the client, and community engagement is always worth it, but that's something that we learned about the leasing process that was very interesting for us. And we can go over some maybe lessons learned or successes or failures in.
Oh, slow down.
Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate the feedback. So in the next slides, we are going to see more of the feedback tied to the community engagement and the relationship in between the survey's responses.
I feel like it's your Latin blood.
I know, that's how I feel living here, so you get a little bit of that. So one of the questions that were very specific in a way about the cultural integration and the community engagement was the question that we asked about how satisfied people are about artwork, furniture, colors, textures, and things tied to that are culturally specific. And you can see that a lot of the people were happy about that. So that shows that we were able to design something that was responding to the community engagement feedback that we received. Another question that it was great to read all the responses is how people feel about living in Nueva Esperanza. Most of the people were feeling that it's a place that they can stay. And it was very interesting to read the responses in Spanish, because most of the people were saying that it's a place that feels like home. So that's, I think, at the end, our goal, to design a place that feels like home and is meaningful to them. So that's, again, something that proves that the community engagement was successful. I think it's to the other side.
No,
Okay. So we also wanted to ask some questions tied to the design itself and see how we were able to respond to the community engagement feedback. And we added this photo specifically, even though it was not a question in the survey, because the design of this unit and this kitchen was coming from the community engagement. They wanted to have for this particular project a kitchen and dining that was divided from the living room, so we were able to implement that. So being able to do these big moves in the design and listen to the community engagement feedback was relevant. A few other questions tied to the design that we ask are how satisfied they are with the community room, with common areas, with amenities in general, and most of the people were satisfied or very satisfied. So that was, again, a lot of information that we gathered in the community engagement process, as well as the outdoor areas, and as I mentioned, with the site plan, incorporating play areas according to the population that we were serving, the ages that we were thinking that families will have little kids that wanted to have play areas for those ages, piñata poles, and having different plazas with different characters. Turned out that it was very successful for this project as well.
So we spent a lot of time on the data, and I think some of the things we've discussed, following up on that, was sometimes I think the questions in our post-occupancy survey can feel kind of generic or a little, I don't know, how should I put it, personal and not so specific. We still feel like those are valid questions, and that's what we're trying to explain, is that it's okay to ask those sort of squishy questions that are really alluding to, does it feel like home? Those are, getting data on those types of questions are actually very valuable, and not just because they validate the community engagement process, but because, frankly, that's what we're here to do, and that's what design and an owner is meant to be delivering, is creating places that people want to stay and that feel like home. And so it is a worthwhile type of question to be asking in this process. So the last part of this process is the data-driven change, and really what we want to bring home with you all, not just the data that we received. Because we feel that, and I think a lot of us feel like that, making real change with the data should really be at the heart of what we're doing, and we should allow this data to inform future design. We should allow it to inform all of our clients' standards. We need to make sure that the data is actually allowing the owner and the property manager, resident services, to actually respond to what the resident needs, and that it also should be leading to advocacy. And so we're going to walk through that, but it's really important to know that while the data is great, that it's only as good as your follow through, and so that's what we want to talk about next. So, but before you can follow through, you have to acknowledge limitations. It's the rough part of being an owner and an architect in this process, is that we all know that there are limitations, and so starting with what those limitations are and agreeing to how we address them is important. So we asked questions in the post-occupancy survey that we know are limited in how we can change, but we still should ask those questions because they're still important. And so some of those main topics that we know are limited in how we can actually address them are related to cost, are related to cultural and resident-specific response, and to code. And so in this post-occupancy survey, like Eugenia has mentioned, there is opportunity for a resident to give a written response. So we want to talk about real quickly some of what those written responses are telling us, and acknowledge that they are limited in how we can make change. And so one of the questions we asked was related to cost, was how satisfied are you with your cooling system in your apartment? We know that we can only provide so much cooling because frankly, we could only pay for so much cooling and heating, but especially cooling. And the response we received from one of the residents was that it does not seem to cool the bedrooms, but only the living and the kitchen. We know this. This is a limitation. We can't afford to cool all the rooms. And frankly, the fact that they were able to cool the living room was a client's decision to go above and beyond what code actually mandated at that time. Now code requires it. Thank you, but we still can only afford to cool certain spaces. And so the budget does not allow. We know this is a limitation, but it's still worth acknowledging this limitation and seeing if this is something that as a future goal or operational standard, that's something we want to address in the future with the owner. We also know that cultural and resident-specific responses are going to come about, and sometimes we're limited in how the actual design and development responds to those. So one of the questions we asked were, how satisfied are you with the cooling system in your apartment? One resident chose to tell us that, I never use the air conditioning because I'm Asian, and I like it warm. And that's not something we actually ever thought we would hear a response of, and we didn't actually include the Asian population in the community engagement process. It was very culturally responsive in this specific project to the Latinx and the Somali communities. So sometimes we're not able to make all cultural representation in a project in the design process, but it's something that we know is a limitation that the post-occupancy survey process will catch and we'll have to discuss. Code-wise, one of the questions we asked was, how satisfied are you with the noise levels in your apartment? I think everybody in the room probably nods their head because we've all talked about noise. And the resident responded with, we don't like how the downstairs neighbor is always complaining about the noise when my kids are small and we are running and playing in the house. We know that code requires us to have certain sound transmission ratings between apartments. It is very expensive, and we are often meeting code minimums, but often never really exceeding code minimums from a noise separation standpoint because, frankly, you can't afford it. And so we acknowledge these limitations and as part of this process, and we bring them up because it's good to acknowledge them and it's good to encourage the conversation as the process evolves. That said, we do know that there are opportunities where we can focus our priorities as a result of these post-occupancy surveys, and we can actually create physical change. We know that some of these topics are also part of those limitations at the same time, but the areas that we think are focus priorities for physical change could be parking, heating and cooling, kitchens, sound, transmittance, safety, security, and laundry. We recognize and we encourage that owners, operators prioritize and make goals for focused areas of improvement. And we as designers agree that that is a great way to try to, you can't bite off everything, but maybe we bite off one or maybe two of these elements. Some of the feedback we received from Vienna Star, which was interesting, was the dining rooms need to be bigger, right? So how can we address physical change in future designs? Or some of the feedback we received was that the bedrooms are too expensive for the space that they give. And so some of those things are actionable change and can create physical change in future developments. One of the other things that we encourage as the architect in collaboration with our clients is that we think that the post-occupancy survey process should inform the client's future developments through standards, through creating standards. Not all clients are ready to do that, but we do think that the post-occupancy survey can lead to that, and is a really wonderful process to really make sure that we are addressing and creating change with the client. In the process of getting feedback from Vienna Star in the post-occupancy survey process, one of the really important things that we heard from Vienna Star was that in addition to a post-occupancy survey, a client really should have their own survey process internally with the maintenance team, with the asset team, management, development, resident services, and lease-up teams, and that all those surveys are very valuable. And frankly, it's how they make decisions as an owner to prioritize what decisions and changes to make in the future. And without that feedback, how do you prioritize? So for instance, Bienestar made this really great example and reference that in a resident survey like this, a lot of the residents ask for more storage space. But we all know the space is space, right? And so if Bienestar does not create their own survey process internally, how do they know to balance that space allocation? If they have a survey with their maintenance team might also say, I need more storage. And because who doesn't want more storage? And it's then on the owner to really decide and prioritize who gets that storage. And if the owner has that feedback, and because they've done their own surveying internally, then they're able to prioritize who they're giving that storage to. And as Bienestar put it, I'm giving it to my maintenance team. And as a result, like that was just a really lovely example to hear from Bienestar, as this is an important part of the process, and you really should be in this presentation acknowledging that surveys of residents is not the only part of the process, and that really should be a surveying of all the other teams that go into it.
Yeah, and just want to visualize how we started this presentation about we didn't want it to talk only about the post-occupancy survey. We wanted to emphasize the importance of fitting the survey in a whole design process and the before and the after. And when we started internally doing post-occupancy surveys, in our head was more like a timeline. We were having very clear that we needed to do a lot of work upfront, having a robust community engagement, go through the design process, and then when the project was done, wait at least a year, and then being able to share and do the post-occupancy survey, and take the time after to really evaluate the information and the value of their responses and how can we do better in the future. But this kind of like timeline and linear way of thinking the design is not longer valid for us, because we come up to the realization that everything goes in full circle, and what's ended up being in the timeline, the last item and the evaluation of the post-occupancy survey become maybe the first step in the next project. So it's definitely a cycle. We are learning constantly, and the way we do things will evolve as the necessity of the community will evolve, but this is the way we are currently thinking about the process and how we can do post-occupancy surveys in a way that is meaningful and really help to shape the future, the next projects, inform our clients and our design team.
And then last but not least is the layering of advocacy. This could be a whole presentation. We acknowledge that. And so we're not going to make this a whole presentation. But advocacy is an important part of the process, and it's a layering on top of it all. Because frankly, you need to advocate internally if you're the owner, or if you're the architect, you have to advocate externally to make this process happen, right? We are here presenting this to you. We are advocating that this is a process that has significant value, not just to the owner, not just to the maintenance team, but to the resident and to us all doing better in design and creating homes. You also have to advocate and explain why this value has process, this process has value, excuse me, because otherwise, it doesn't happen. And so it's not just saying this is something I'd like to do. This is something you have to really bring home and you have to advocate for with everyone. And the Bienestar project with Nueva Esperanza was really a lovely example of how advocacy on the owner and the design side really put a whole process into place. And everybody fought to include this entire process in the project to make sure and ensure that it was a success. Just because we got negative feedback didn't mean that the process wasn't worthwhile. In addition to that, we know that we need to advocate that change happens as a result of this process. All of us need to advocate for the change. For instance, if some of the feedback we're receiving in the post-occupancy surveys are showing that, for instance, the community spaces and were well done, but really that residents are displeased or continue to have negative feedback about the dwelling units, their homes. Maybe what we need to be advocating for in the future is that more of a focus, more money, more time is spent in homes, in placemaking, and putting more of the dollars of the project into that, into the actual dwelling units. If that's where all of that feedback continues to come about, is we all need to advocate that that's actually where the focus should be spent. Not saying that we don't spend time in those community spaces. One of the things we heard from Bienestar was that actually the community spaces, which are super robust on the Nueva Esperanza project, that community room is actually not always accessible to residents. So lovely to have it, but also it would have been also really nice to advocate for more money perhaps being spent within the dwelling unit for cooling or for other features that would have made residents happy. And then last but not least, advocacy needs to happen with everybody. Like I sort of talked about before, it needs to happen with the architect. You need to be advocating with the developers, with the owners. You need to be advocating with the general contractor. And you have to have a lot of hard conversations sometimes because it's a balance of cost and execution, and so advocacy happens with them. And advocacy happens with your jurisdictions, so that limitations, acknowledging the limitations, a lot of times has to go back to some of the challenges with code and those restrictions. We all need to advocate as part of this process and share information with the jurisdictions about what is and is not working. And that is how we come, to Eugenia's point, full circle. And we need to use processes like post-occupancy surveys to advocate for change with those jurisdictions as well, to promote better homes and better places to be. So with that, thank you. And we're gonna open up the floor to questions.
Very clear.
Yeah. Yeah, want me to, do you have the ability to project? Do you want me to bring it to you? Thank you.
You might have addressed this, but did you incentivize, you talked about when you send the survey, I was curious, and again, I might have missed this, I apologize. Did you do it via mail? Did you do it door to door? Did you have a person facilitate over the phone for people who didn't engage that way? Did you incentivize with gift cards? Like, I'm interested more in the process around getting residents to want to do the survey.
This is a very interesting question because I think it's the way we do the process of how we share the post-occupancy survey is depend of the clients and the residents. So we have always a conversation first of what's best for sharing this survey. Is the population able to do this digitally? Is it better to have like a flyer in the common areas with a barcode so they can do that? Or is it better to leave printed copies in the resident's office so they can do this by hand and then return it? So that's the way we were doing like the two things. We were offering digital, we were offering printed copies, and then we were gathering all the information and combining the results. And We have always like a 2-week time frame, so we give enough time for people to complete, but also having a deadline is helpful too. And I think in the Nueva Esperanza project, for example, where it was very successful, that on top of that, we have the help from their team, the maintenance team, and their leaders in Bienestar, that they were able to share the information that the survey exists in their internal meetings with residents. So at the time that we did the post-occupancy survey, they were having some meetings with all the residents. They were able to share and offer the survey. They also said that the incentive was a gift card. We provided gift cards, but again, that could be different depending on the projects. But I think all this is, it leads to a success for more participation. Like in this project, we have a lot of participation for that reason. And again, having different languages depend on the population change, yeah.
One other thing is from Bienestar, we heard that the survey was offered to residents at the 1-year check-in, which I'm pretty sure, did they say that's mandated by Oregon Housing Community Services? I believe there is a Oregon Housing OHCS has a year check-in requirement with residents, and so in that check-in with residents, they then also issued and made residents aware of the survey. So it was helpful as that formal process to include the survey then. But the gift cards were much appreciated, and the digital as well as the paper format was very easy for Scott Edwards, because anything that came in by paper, we just put actually into the SurveyMonkey, and then we were able to get one output per question once we put that data in.
I want to add one thing that is part of the process. At the beginning, we ask about the name of the person and in which unit they live. So then we are able to deliver the gift card. And that was, I mentioned that because we were unsure if people were feeling maybe that they didn't want it to put their name, or, but it was not a problem at all. And we explained that the main reason is like then we know who to thank for.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Thank you.
How do you go over the results with the client? And how do you address those questions like parking, being very familiar with this site and knowing you want units or you want parking? So it's kind of a two-part question.
We encourage that we take the data in whatever format we get, and we actually add it, like I said, to like the SurveyMonkey. And then we encourage that you have an actual meeting with your client, but asking before you have the meeting, really who should be there to hear it. And so sharing that, I mean, the data, if we put it into SurveyMonkey, comes out in these lovely graphs, and that's very helpful. But we also make sure that we include the information that is the actual written feedback. When it comes to the data that is less desirable to receive, like the parking, part of that, what we were trying to convey in the presentation was that we know that these are limitations. So it's just having a very honest and transparent conversation with the client that says, this is the data, this is the feedback, and allowing the owner to figure out how they'd like to respond. It's not really so much, I think, on the architect to force how the response should go, but if we document it and we acknowledge it after the survey, that's one part of the process. It's then reminding the client before they do more development that this process was value added, and we have to bring it up at the beginning of any future development so that it's a priority, and it's part of the goal setting process to making sure that we acknowledge that data in the future. Did you, sorry, yes. You go ahead, you can add another question.
Well, I was going to say,
Yeah.
on parking,
Yeah.
is there any,
I'm sorry. They're very,
On parking, is there any intention of talking to the owner to have conversations with the residents as they move in? That's like, we would rather house your neighbor than your car. And so kind of helping them with expectations using that data.
That's a good question. What we heard is like when they have the first meeting with the leasing team, they go over all these things, like how the cooling system works, the whys, how the common areas work, the availability, and also parking. In this project, for example, they have assigned parking. So the idea was to have parking nearby units too. So that was part of the first conversation. But then there are still people that instead of having, let's say, one car, they have two. So maybe these are some of the complaints, like we want more. Some comments that we got is like, we prefer to have less green space and more parking. That maybe goes against to other goals of the project. But I think in this instance, we'd ask, like, are you going to make like a whole meeting with residents and explain this because it's a repetitive issue, or is like a one-by-one because people go to the maintenance team and talk to them, or the resident's office? And I think their preference is to treat this as a one-by-one and try to address this with each person instead of having like a one meeting where they start like covering all the topics that is so hard to achieve everything. So it will be case by case.
they recommended not a public forum. They recommended, like Eugenia was just saying, a resident by resident communication strategy that conveyed the rules, and to have it on the outset, and to not wait for the post-occupancy survey to start to respond to a resident, but to really take it head on. That said, just because they address it early on with residents doesn't mean that they still didn't think the post-occupancy survey process wasn't value added, but that they try to address it early on. That doesn't mean residents aren't unhappy.
You have a question?
I have two questions. First, have you noticed any correlation between the level of community engagement, the beginning of the process, with the receptivity and engagement of the residents in doing the post-occupancy?
I'm going to try to answer that. I think so. And the reason is because some of the positive affirmation we received in the survey showed that outside of these, like, challenges with parking, residents feel heard and feel like there has been a home made for them that, not for everybody, but for many, are responsive to their needs. And those questions, while very broad in many ways, seeing a lot of the individual responses, were acknowledging that they felt represented in the project and in the development. Outside of those little, annoyances like parking, we made a point to ask a few questions that really were getting at the idea of, do you feel represented? And I think the responses to those questions affirm that, yes, that community engagement process really did a good job at acknowledging and representing the majority of residents that the development serves. So I think so. Yeah. Would you want to tie to that?
I just want to add that something that tells us that it was a good representation, for example, in this particular project that we engaged with the Latinx community. We did the survey in Spanish, and we got many responses in Spanish. So the same way that we are doing community engagement, trying to be flexible and trying not to have a barrier, we want to do the same with the post-occupancy format. We want to have flexibility and not to be a barrier that could be a language or any other cultural thing. So having this available in the same language, I think it helps a lot. Yeah.
Was also interesting was to see the difference in responses within like the Spanish responses versus the English responses. And there were, I think in acknowledgement of the community engagement, it seemed like a lot more, didn't seem like, the data showed us that the Spanish speaking responses acknowledged the community engagement more than the English responses did. And I think that is very much so a direct correlation to how effective the community engagement was. And that was definitely feedback we received from Bienestar when we were going through this presentation. Was we see some of the one-off responses from residents that weren't represented in the community engagement. We see that, but we also see that this community engagement process was wildly successful, and we will do it again, even if it doesn't represent every single person that lives in our community, because we can't control that, and nor should we. But it was definitely, the feedback from Bannister was very positive about the community engagement, and the post-occupancy survey validated that for them. Yeah.
Do you share the results with the residents of the, have anyone, I mean, I can see a person asking, oh, I'm answering all these questions. Am I going to know what is it? What?
You can go ahead.
Yeah, now that we are aware, I don't know, that might be like a client questions if they want to share the result of the survey. I don't know if they will care as much about the collection of all the data. So we didn't have that request, but definitely yes, for the gift certificates, like we have like a few questions of how this will.
I'm trying to think of all the surveys I filled out, and if anyone, trying to think of the surveys I filled out, about like flying on United. And no one ever tells me what everyone else thinks, and maybe, but I don't, I'm interested in that question because I wonder if, as part of this process, if there is value there. And what I do, I'm going to take your question a little bit differently in here and respond and say what we do know, and what we did hear from Bienestar is that residents need to know that they've been heard. And whether or not it's telling them what the data is, that the residents need to know that they've been heard, and the post-occupancy survey is part of that. We are listening and telling that to the residents. So sharing with them some way or another that they have been heard is worthwhile. Yeah. That was a very good question. Thank you.
Any other question?
It's been a long conference, and we appreciate you all sticking with us. Thank you very much. You have one question? Okay.
Thanks. So I think some of what we find in the development community, because everything is so constrained, is that we're making choices and trade-offs. Do you ever find it effective to ask a very pointed question to residents? Would you choose this thing, or would you choose this thing? Or do you like to have something that is open-ended that allows the designer and the owner to apply that feedback as it arises?
Do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
I don't think that we give choices in the post-occupancy survey questions. These are the type of questions that we usually ask in the community engagement process, like preferences of like the design of the kitchen. I think in the survey, to be able to collect data and then gather information and understand what's successful or what's not, we ask more like how satisfied are them with each thing, and then we leave the space for them to comment on what's not working or what they are expecting. So in this space is where we capture, for example, if they want to have a different sink or if they want to have something different, but it's not that we leave like choices. It's more like how satisfied or not are they with the specific question, and then giving the opportunity to comment more on that.
Yeah, the written area definitely allows residents that are interested in giving that very specific feedback space to do so. But Eugenia did bring up a very important part. The community engagement is the opportunity for choice, and encouraging and soliciting that feedback for choice in community engagement is incredibly helpful. And I think the post-occupancy survey for us validated that that went well. So, but that's a great question. Okay, now you can all go home. Thank you very much.